Hey, so today I've recreated the tone, or tried to recreate the tone from one of my favorite sounding records, Anthems of Rebellion by Arch Enemy. This mix is probably one of my favorite mixes of all time. I think the guitar tone is amazing. Just the mix in general, like the way the drums, the guitars, bass all sound together, just really, really pleasing to me, and always has been one of my favorite guitar tones. Always loved like the kick drum sound and the snare, and it's always been something that I wanted to kind of try and achieve. Obviously, it's an Andy Sneap mix. Most people know I'm a big fan of his work. His mixes kind of shape the way I hear or want to hear heavy music. So for this one, I kind of knew a few tidbits of information to help try and get close. So the guitars were a PV XXX, which I have one behind me. This was actually the very first proper valve amp I owned, the very, very first head I got when it first came out when I was a kid. And I think it's one of the most underrated amps in metal. And I'm talking about the very original one they did, not the two. To me, it's just got a really linear, really even mid-range to it, which means it's very kind of sculptable, if that's a word or not, within the mix. There's no kind of like holes in the tone. It's just like really good and even, and it's yeah, just a really pleasing amp to play through. And I think underrated and maybe underused, probably just because of the way it looked, especially back in the day. And I know it was recorded through a Marshall cab, a 16 ohm Marshall cab. The difference between 8 ohms and 16 ohms is 16 is usually a bit brighter, or always brighter. And there were two secondary tracks of 50 on 50. And I'm assuming from the information I gathered that the XXX was the louder amp out of the two amps, but I could be wrong. And I also heard that the XXX was unboosted on the way in, and they used a Seymour Duncan JB pickup. So that is all of the information I heard or acquired through the Andy Sneap forum, and now I'm going to kind of show you how I emulated this guitar tone. It's important to say, and I've said this before in some of the other videos, that trying to emulate a guitar tone without having the exact same speaker or an impulse response of the speaker used is always really impossible. Like, all speakers sound different. They're essentially made of paper, and like, you know, it's kind of like cardboard. So there's a lot of variety in, you know, the exact same cab and the exact same speaker. So just because you have a Marshall 1960B cab with vintage 30s at 16 ohms, if you get one from, you know, even two of the same, you know, assembly line could sound different. So just bear that in mind. I've done some quite heavy-handed EQ moves to try and get these guitars to sound like the guitars on the record. Whether or not Andy Sneap would have done this level of EQing, I doubt it. He probably was doing a bit more kind of broad moves than I've done, and I think potentially some of the EQ moves I've been doing here are to try and copy the sound of that specific speaker that was used. And if you've ever recorded and mic'd up a speaker or a cabinet, and you've tried every speaker on that cabinet, you'd be surprised at how different they all sound from each other, especially in the high end. So some of those EQ moves that I'm doing could be just trying to replicate how that exact speaker sounds, or it could also be similar kind of moves that Andy may have done in his mix. I have no idea. I'm just sort of covering myself before you see a bunch of crazy EQ to try and get this to sound like the record. So let's take a look. So I'm going to open up my plugin here. This is the based on the PV XXX. Yeah, I went unboosted as well. Interesting. I always wary of doing that. I have this sort of like almost OCD thing where I just feel like I always have to have the tube screamer running, but I am trying to get as close to the original tone as possible. So I'm revisiting this. I haven't actually checked out this session for a few months. So it's good to see that I did try and stay true to the unboosted sound. These are the settings on the XXX, and for the cabinet we're using the Marshall cab from my pack, and it says there's a bit of a blend in terms of the percentage there, but that one being minus 10 dB, I don't know how much of that we're really going to hear in the mix. So let's hear how that guitar sounds isolated on its own. So yeah, the EQ on this, like the mid-range, like I said, really even across the board on this amp. And the cab, I don't know yet. Obviously, vintage 3069 Marshall cab. It's a bit brighter than a Mesa cab with vintage 30s at 8 ohms, so I'm a bit further off the center here. Again, in terms of what this visual representation looks like, it may not be quite as far over as this is showing it to be, but because to me, if I was miking up this cab, I'd probably have my mic there, but in terms of like this image accurately portraying the exact place where the mic is, we don't need to worry about that. Let's just use our ears. So this is how I've got the amp sounding. And then I've got 2 tracks of 5150. So here are the settings for the 5150. I've boosted this one with the Maxon OD808. These are the amp settings. Kind of a classic 5150 sound. Instantly kind of reminds me of Carcass Heartwork, just listening to this. Again, using the same speaker, and again, just an SM57, 100% to the left, so you can ignore this part of the screen, which we're not using any of in the mix. And now on to what I've done for the guitar bus EQ-wise. So the way that I deal with quad track guitars, normally I have my main ones 100% panned left and right, and the secondary guitars are a bit quieter in the mix and panned not quite as far, and this kind of helps thicken them up. I like hearing loud guitars in metal mixes, and I think hard panning everything when you're dealing with quad track guitars can sound a bit weird, and I think, yeah, like the whole point is to get that wall of sound, and you don't need to have completely hard pan guitars for them to, you know, not eat up the entire mix, and it doesn't necessarily sound, you know, too mono or anything. They're still off to the sides, just not 100%. So here's how the guitars sound all together. So I've got the C4 multiband compressor. You can do this with various other multiband compressors or the like the FabFilter Pro MB. This is just kicking in. We've only got it set to this area, so between 66 and 282, and it's only really kicking in and ducking down the low end or the low mids on palm mutes. So not too extreme, just doing enough just to keep the mix a bit clear in that area. So onto the EQ. Quite a lot going on here to try and emulate the sound as closely as possible. So brightening up the high end here at 12K, there's a lot of kind of life to these guitars in the mix. And whether or not there was a lot of high-end boosted or boosted in the same way, I have no idea. It could have been just like more of a high shelf as opposed to these two separate ones. But I found this area, which I always do, to be a little bit too fizzy sounding. And it's, you know, it could be that the cab they used just was a bit darker and doesn't have as much information here, or maybe this was something that was done in the mix. I don't know, but either way, I can show you this kind of area now. So you may have heard me say this before. When boosting high end, like this is the area where like the grit and the snarl of the guitars really cut through the mix, but it's also like a problem area where like cabs tend to whistle, and this is the area where the guitars just kind of come to life. But at the same time, if you have too much around this area, you get too much of that fizz and your guitars can sound a bit soft. So this is a way of kind of getting simultaneously bright and dark, at the same time. Maybe that's not necessarily the best way of explaining it, but I can kind of show you how it would sound without these two on. And then we can hear these two, just these two boosting high end. So this notch here at 3K, I don't know if that's something that was just inherent in that specific speaker that they used, or something that may have been notched out in the mix, but this is what that frequency sounds like. And right next to it, 3.2 more specifically, was kind of whistling on the cab. There's a good amount of low mids here. This is kind of the notey area of the guitar tone. This is where you really hear the clarity in the note, even though, you know, we're in a lower tuning of, I think they're in C standard. So maintaining or sometimes boosting this area really helps the notes and the articulation and the kind of warmth of the tone come through a bit, especially on Marshall cabs that don't necessarily have a lot of lower mids in them inherently. This area here is kind of like your classic kind of cab, kind of boxy, kind of lower whistle thing. And this area can kind of cloud up the mix quite easily. Got quite a big scoop there in the mids. Again, sort of doing what I'm doing with the C4 compressor here, but this is a dynamic EQ, really tackling that problematic kind of woomphy low end or low mids on the guitars. That's making my master bus processing clip there when I boosted that. And just doing a little boost before we kind of do a high pass there. It kind of seems like a counterintuitive move, but I think there's just like, there is some low end to these guitars. They're not just completely, you know, mid-rangey sounding, and this area kind of did, to my ear, need a bit of a boost to get them closer to the record. But at the same time, there's unwanted information below 60 that we don't really need. So that's what I've done to try and mimic the tone as close as possible. Again, this is not necessarily how I would choose to EQ guitars in a mix. This is a lot more involved than I would try and be. I normally try and get my guitars as close to mix ready with the source tones or with the amp tones, or in this case just with the plugin itself, and then do more kind of gentle moves. And sometimes this kind of notching is required. So yeah, that's how it sounds in the mix. Let me know if there are any other kind of metal tones you'd want to see me emulate. Also, I just want to say thank you to everyone that has signed up to my Patreon community. You get the stems for demos like this when I do them, and I'd also like to hear some of your mixes with some of those files that I've put up on the Patreon as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.